This episode of the City Manager Unfiltered podcast is sponsored by Holbrook Asphalt. Maintaining your roads is one of the most difficult tasks for any city government. The good news is the secret to making it easier is only 3 letters: HA5. HA5 extends the life of roads and reduces the financial burden on your taxpayers. HA5 is an innovative pavement preservation treatment trusted by over 300 public agencies. It keeps good roads in good condition, reducing repair costs and saving taxpayer dollars. Join the hundreds of other cities making the smart choice. Choose HA5 for longer-lasting roads and a healthier budget. Learn more at holbrookasphalt.com/city. That's holbrookasphalt.com/city. Check the show notes for a link. All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America, and this is the second installment of an interview from my dining room table in Wichita, Kansas. With me today is Matt Jensby. Matt, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Joe.
You know, Matt, we've known each other for quite a while now. I'll never forget the time that I was the city administrator in the city of Sedgwick, tiny little Sedgwick. We were going through a lot of stuff financially. We were in tough times, and I was really counting. I was the bean counter over there, really trying to mind my pennies and save my dollars. And we had a need for a police vehicle.
That's right.
And I reached out to you, and you graciously helped us out and provided us with a police vehicle that was very comparable to what we had, and it helped us get by for a little while. So thank you very much.
Yes, I remember that. I think you guys got a couple police cars from us, actually.
I think you got one after I left.
I think we did.
Yeah. Or
yes.
Sorry, I think they got. I think my buddy Brian Daly, who I hired in as my police chief, I think he got hooked up by you guys after I left or something like that. Yeah. It's a crazy small world when you think about. I mean, what was that? That had been something around 2019 or 2020, because I was only there from 2019 to 2021 or something.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that some 5 years later we'd be sitting in my dining room table,
in your dining room, talking to each other on microphones. That's right.
and I'm not employed as a city administrator now, and yet you are.
Yes. Yep.
What a long strange trip this has been. I was talking to Brian recently, Brian Daly. So I hired Brian Daly. He had spent some time over in the Middle East working as a contractor. He had some military experience, and I hired him in Sedgwick to be my police chief. And he was all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He has all these, ideas and expectations, and he wanted to do X, Y, and Z. A real go-getter. I'm so proud of him, and I'm so grateful that I took a shot on him and brought him aboard, because he's just been amazing. But he came in with all these ideas and expectations of what life would be like as a police chief and what kind of resources he could get.
Right.
And I had to say, hey, let's slow your roll a little bit. I'm the city manager, city administrator. There's a lot of things I got to take into account other than just one specific department, right? Yep. And so I've been wanting to have him on the podcast to talk about a variety of things. But I reached out to you recently, and we set this up like within a couple of days, because I had received a message from a gentleman, the police chief in Albany, Georgia. His name's Michael Pursley. He had said, hey, have you ever done an interview with somebody who's gone from the police chief role to the city manager role? I go, no, I haven't. And so I'm like, but I know Matt has. Yeah. So that's why I wanted to have you on the show.
Very good. Well, I'm happy to be here, and hopefully I can lend some advice to those aspiring to move from a department-type director position, be it a police chief, a fire chief, or even a public works director, into the public management
That was
field.
My route.
Yeah.
From Goddard to
That's
Sedgwick.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you have an interesting background, Matt, because not only were you a police chief and with the same department for quite a period of time in Mays, Kansas, which is the fastest growing. I think it's the fastest growing city in Kansas right now.
It could still be.
Yeah.
We grew very rapidly over a 10, 15-year period.
What was your population when you first got hired in? Do you remember?
Gosh, I don't remember our population. I was one of 3 officers when I got hired back in the early 90s. And the town itself was very small, and there was no growth. And that's because the city did not have a water system, didn't have a public water system. Everybody in the city was on wells. So they got a public water system, and once they did that, the
Took off,
city
huh?
just took off.
Yeah.
So we grew very rapidly as a department. It was a part-time police department. When I started, I transitioned it to a full-time police department. And when I left, I think we had about 18 personnel in the police department.
Just in the PD.
Yeah, just in the PD. Yeah.
Yeah. And you didn't start out as a police chief, but you were the police chief for how long?
18 years.
18 years.
Yeah. Nope. I started off as a snot-nosed street cop, working third shift, and like many small departments, you go through your progression of different chiefs.
Yeah.
You know, guys will come from a larger city, they'll be a police chief for a couple years, and then they'll move on to bigger things. So, you know, small towns are a stepping stone for a lot of people, and police chief is just one of those. So went through a couple chiefs and finally got to the point where I was offered the position. I was actually offered the position after about the third chief, I believe, and I turned it down. I just didn't feel I was ready for that. I was too young. So served under another chief for a couple years, and at that point, I felt I was ready. So I took the position and served for the next 18 years as the police chief there.
And how long did you serve under LeMunyon?
18 years.
Oh, so he was the city manager for the entire time that you were there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And for the audience, LeMunyon was a former police chief for Wichita PD, correct?
He was. Yeah.
And I kind of want to unpack that dynamic a little bit. We'll come back to that in a minute. I don't want to jump too far ahead because I think that's an interesting situation to go from a police chief to a city administrator, right? In his shoes, and then you're as not only that, but you're a chief working for a previous chief of a large city, which I'm sure could have some intimidation factor.
Very
to it,
intimidating,
right?
yes.
And then you come full circle, and now you're a police chief, or now you're a city administrator. So it's a pretty fascinating journey that you've been on. But we'll come back to that in a minute because not only did you serve as a police chief, and not only were you heavily committed to serving your community in that capacity, Matt. But I remember you serving on the school board for the school district that I live in. My son went to Mays South High School, and in the Mays School District, Unified School District, and you were on the school board there for a few years, right? How was that experience?
Yep. It was good, and I think it really helped lend itself to the city manager role that I have now, in the aspect that I can relate to the people who are on the city council, and I know kind of or have an idea of what information they have when we present information, what is good information from them, what is just enough and not too much.
Yeah.
And the understanding, I guess, or knowing that a lot of people on boards, be it city councils, school boards, commissions, don't understand public finance, you know, and being able to draw back on those experiences of being on a school board and helping explain some of the nuances of public finance, because it's totally different than the private sector, and that's where a majority of your people on your commissions and boards come from, right?
Yeah. What do you mean, Matt? We have a $30 million budget. Can we just move the money from here over to there?
Right. Yeah, a lot more things that have to take place. Yeah,
doesn't work that way, right?
It does not. No.
Yeah. So you were on the council there, or the school board for a while. You also got to obviously understand the citizen component, engagement dynamic, some of those issues and what have you, and just sort of the retail politicking aspect, I guess, of how you as a elected official, and then now you in your role as a city administrator, it's tough to balance those meat and potatoes issues that we got to take care of in a city when it comes to things like infrastructure and public safety, right? With a lot of the sort of aesthetic, fluffy things that a lot of the residents seem to be caught up on because that's what they see, right? People, they don't see the pipes in the ground. They don't see the infrastructure the way that we do. And, you know, it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah, with, you know, being a police chief or any department head, you're very focused on one thing, and that's a police department or a fire department.
Your immediate
or a
world,
public
right?
works department, and you know a lot about that business. You know, if you've been there any length of time, you know everything about every function in that department. And I think that's been one of the biggest transitions that I've had to make, is not knowing everything about it and knowing a little bit about everything.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
if that
absolutely.
makes sense.
Oh, no, absolutely.
So,
it does make sense. Yeah, you went from being a subject matter expert to now you're a journalist.
Very, good analogy.
Yeah,
Perfect.
absolutely. one of the things that you're really good at, which I think a lot of police chiefs tend to be really good at, is this ability to engage and talk to other people. There's, there has to be an extroverted component. You might not be naturally an extroverted person, but in order to be successful, I think as a police chief, in many ways, you have to have the ability to turn on that extrovertedness and engage with people, to be personable, develop those relationships, right?
Right.
And so I give you credit because all throughout our relationship of knowing each other, we've had regular touch-ins, and you've shared your journey, or you've reached out to me seeking advice or counsel, and I've only just been sort of like a couple steps ahead of you in that process. But I've been trying to impart my knowledge when I could and what have you. At what point in your police chief journey did you have this this realization that you wanted to be a city manager?
If I look back, I think it was about the 15-year mark when I really thought about doing something or elevating my career to something else to kind of finish out in. I think that came from, for me personally, being in the police business for so many years, things become routine and it's not challenging. And I think you could say that with any job.
Absolutely.
Things come in front of you and you're like, this has happened before. This is what we do. So there wasn't a lot of challenge there. So I think it was, it was probably around a 15-year mark that I really decided I wanted to do something else. And in our local retirement system, elevating that, my final pay, so I would
Right.
be
Are you on the old
compensated.
system where the highest year basically impacts
Yes.
the whole kit and caboodle, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So your final average salary,
Yeah.
looking at something I could do to get that up and still stay in the same field. So went back through Kansas University.
I think I'm going to step on you there a little bit because I think I've heard this before. I think Kansas has a little quirk in their caper system, at least on the old tier, that it's the average of your last few years, right? It's not your
I
top
think it's your
performing-
last 3 years.
It's not your top performing 3 years. It's your last 3 years or something like that.
I
correct?
believe you're correct.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on it, but I think you're correct.
The
on
reason
that.
why I had a former police chief in another jurisdiction who had a predicament where they were working for another agency. At the time, they'd spent many years there, and essentially overtime was going to be cut and whatnot, and they were going from a role, I think it was like a vice role, where they were spending a lot of time in doing overtime work and what have you.
Okay.
And so the idea was that if they stayed there very much longer, they were essentially going to have a negative impact on their pension. And so they had to transition to another department become a police chief and get that salary back up to kind of what they were making with all the overtime. Does that make sense? So there's a little quirk on that because I think a lot of pension systems, this tends to be your best 3 years or your best year, not your last three, right? It's just kind of an interesting situation.
Yeah, that is interesting.
So I'm curious though. You spent the 18 years or so with Mays, and you at that 15-year mark of being the police chief, did you feel like, well, I can maybe go to another agency that's larger or more dynamic or have more opportunities and try to go that route?
For me, I didn't.
Why?
I was
just
kind
sort
of burnt out
Okay.
on the police stuff.
Okay.
I think really over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of changes in law enforcement and
Right.
public safety. And for me, it felt like you were spending a lot of your time defending your actions and weren't able to be proactive
Right.
in what you were doing. And it
The stuff you enjoy, right?
kind of took the fun out of it.
Yeah.
So I really had no desire to go to a larger agency and be another police chief.
Was the part, when a city like Mays is growing so rapidly, and you went from 3 officers to 18 officers, right? That's a big jump in a short period of time. I'm sure a lot of that was fun and challenging in its own right. But at some point, do you feel like you're just constantly also on the hamster wheel? Does that does that wear you down a little bit? Or was that not really the issue at all?
No, because for me, it was a challenge.
Okay.
It was always doing something new, being able to build something, being able to make something better.
Right.
So, yeah, I didn't experience that at all. It was always a challenge to me until it gets to that point where things level out a little bit, become status quo, and then it's kind of like, here we go again. Same thing, different day sort of thing. So,
getting back to, my buddy Brian Daly, he was my police chief in Sedgwick, and he had been his thought process was he wanted to go become a police chief in a larger community.
Yeah.
Okay. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'll support you. And I did my best and everything I could on that because I owed it to him. He worked his butt off for me, and he delivered exceptional results. And so I went to, I did everything I could. And I told him, I go, but, just understand from the outset, and I'm sure you already know this, Brian, but, it can be a little tough to go from a police chief in one agency to a police chief in another agency, because a lot of times these agencies have these sort of internal cultures or climates where they're promoting from within, right?
Right.
And there can be some difficulties trying to jump into another agency. And, he found himself doing really well. He was punching above his weight, but just missing the final spot, like coming in second or third or whatnot. And I was like, hey, Brian, I know you have the aptitude for this. Like, have you thought about perhaps going to be the city manager, city administrator role? Because, you're not getting any younger.
Yeah.
He's getting up there, and the job wears on you a little bit.
Yep.
And I was like, this job is going to pay you significantly more. And in my opinion, you are a really good candidate for a small town city manager job in Kansas to get your start. And so I sort of reorientated his search away from public safety and over into, the city manager role. And he just took off like a rocket, and he's just killing it out in Medicine Lodge.
Yeah.
Do you have the same sort of feelings or sentiments on that when it came from jumping over from a police chief role to a city administrator role? Did you feel like that there were the barriers to entry were less in a sense? Or
Well, I think for me and talking to other city managers, administrators, getting into the business is tough.
Yeah.
And it's really tough to break in. I applied for a lot of different cities, had a lot of different interviews, was coming in second a lot of times, and I would come in second to somebody who had the experience.
Right.
So once you get your foot in the door and you have that experience, it makes it a lot easier for you. But breaking down that door is it's tough in this field.
It is, Matt. But I will say this too. I know you on a personal level, and I know a little bit more about your search. Is that is true what you just said to a degree, but you also were limited in your opportunities that you could pursue because you had a personal need to stay within a geographic area of
Absolutely.
Wichita.
Yep.
So you could not.
That's very true.
You did not have the luxury of going out and applying for a job like Medicine Lodge, Kansas, or
Yes.
out and to get your start.
Yes.
And so I want to have that caveat because I want people to
Yes.
understand when I'm listening. We're talking about Wichita being the largest city in the state, right? And there's not really a lot of cities in or around Wichita per se. There's some, but the number of opportunities are limited if you're going to be stuck to this geographic area because you had at the time you still had children in high school, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Still do. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. There you go.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm always championing Kansas, and I'm always a booster. So I want the folks who are listening to understand the dynamic of what we're talking about. But yes, you're right. There is, because it's always tough to get the title, no matter what. If you don't have the title, that's the most, and that's what I've said since my posting on LinkedIn for the last 2.5 years, Matt, is that if whatever you got to do to get the title, if you can move out of Southern California and go to the Midwest and get the title and put in your 2-year stint or 3-year stint and get it, like the whole world opens up to you at that point. And now that you have the title in Kechi, which is a little town just outside of Wichita, very near Sedgwick, which is where my first stop was, the sky's going to be a limit for you too, if you want to even go that path.
Very true. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Right.
Getting back to the question that Michael Pursley, the Albany, Georgia police chief, was asking, he says, he believes that there's many similarities to what the police chief does and what the city manager does.
Yeah.
I've talked about how I see an increasing prevalence or number of police chiefs who are migrating into the city manager profession. I'm seeing increasingly a number of fire chiefs that are kind of getting into the profession. Shout out to Steve Pendergrass, one of the founding members of AAME, just like you're a founding member of AAME, but he's a former fire chief out in California who's now, I think, in South Dakota, a small town city manager. Do you agree with the assessment overall that the police chief role is a natural progression into the city manager position? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And I see it a lot, not just with the police chief, but a department head within a city, police chief, fire chief, public works. And I think it lends itself well to the public administration field from the aspect of you learn in those positions how to become a good, if not great, communicator with other people. You learn the budget side of things. You know that very well. Being a police chief and transitioning into that field, I think that was a huge transition for me to make. Is kind of in the police business, you're very guarded, okay, very guarded because of the way you're treated.
Well, and especially just going back to what you said over the change in the last few years of the profession, right? It's you're constantly on guard. Yeah.
Right. So moving into a city administrator role, I found it's somewhat challenging, I guess, to let my guard down.
I was going to say that might be one of the biggest challenges for you, right?
And learn how to talk to people and listen to people. A lot of times in a police role like that, what you say goes. There's not a lot of black and white. There's no gray areas, just by the nature of the position itself.
You're an authoritarian figure. You're
right.
Absolutely right.
You are.
Yeah.
And you have to be in that role. So making that transition and learning, hey, I got to let my guard down. I got to be a little softer. I need to listen to people a little more.
And not have the automatic default position that someone's out to get you just because they're saying something, right?
Right,
yeah.
right. Or they're guilty.
Yeah,
they're guilty. So, in the police world, integrity is very, very important. And
Yes.
I'm not saying it's not in other professions, but, it's very important, and you hold your people to a very high standard.
Well, your
because
career's
of
at
that.
risk. Your career's at risk if your reputation or your credibility is challenged,
Sure,
right?
because of that. And moving into dealing with public employees, you have to let your guard down a little bit when it comes to that, and just learn to have more flexibility, learn that there is a gray area when dealing with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And the my way, the highway is probably not going to work very well in that situation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I do think that I think every department head position has its pros and cons when it comes to, preparing you for that city manager position.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in an ideal world, if you have the opportunity to go to more than one department before becoming a city manager, that'd behoove you and produce some benefits for you. I think one of the greatest benefits about being in that police chief role that prepares you for the city manager role is just having a far more conscious awareness or connection to the external factors outside the organization that I think a lot of department heads and other departments simply are not aware, not subject to, don't even think about. And I think that sort of holistic, comprehensive overview of how, I got to be aware of this stakeholder group, or I got to be aware of how my guys interact with the community over here, or the feedback that we get, because shout out to Brian Daly again, but should have him on the podcast with us right now. But I told Daly when I hired him, I go, you have to understand, this is small town Kansas.
Yeah.
And I said, in many ways, you are going to be more visible and more high profile than me as the city administrator.
Yeah.
And it's very important that you're aware of that. And the flip side too, for those city managers that are listening, you got to be careful how you handle your police chief and your fire chiefs, because they are super connected in your community.
Yes.
And so you better make sure you have firm footing with your governing body in your community, unless you decide if you want to do something with one of your police chiefs or fire chiefs, right?
Right. Yeah. And those are the people that your citizens see.
Absolutely.
They see your police officers. They see those are the face of your city. Police officers, your fire departments, your public works personnel. They see them far more than they see police officers. So those line people are the face of your city.
Unless it's maybe a few select households, right?
Right.
some repeat offenders.
Yes.
They might be getting the
extra treatment.
The PD discount, right?
The frequent flyer, yeah.
So, what part of your being a police chief, in your opinion, do you think was actually the most beneficial? Was it the interaction with the public? Was it the budgeting? Was it the...
I think for me it was the communication part of it. And I'll draw back to an analogy I gave for years and years and years when I did community talks, especially to kids. I would talk about, As a police officer, we have these fancy uniforms. We have all these tools at our disposal. We have pepper spray, we have tasers, we have guns, we have handcuffs. But the most powerful tool that I have is my mouth. And when you learn that that is your most powerful tool, you don't need to rely on those other things.
Right.
You can talk somebody into being under arrest, or you can talk them into a fight. So
Very easily.
yeah. So those years of experience of learning how to talk to people and how to communicate, I really feel was my greatest asset.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Getting into
Totally.
the field.
I
So
can see that.
for me, growing up in a city that was rapidly growing, I probably had the advantage to have experiences that other police chiefs didn't, because when a city grows that rapidly, a lot of things fall just by default onto your department head. So
Absolutely.
I was involved in, many meetings about infrastructure and growth and budget and all that other stuff. So I was experienced to that and had more of an insight than I think maybe some other people would. So
Yeah, in a traditional sort of maybe more stable or
Yes.
as far as department, right, or organization, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
You almost got, in a sense, almost like a crash course or a mini course in being like an assistant city manager in a sense, right? Is that fair
you
to say?
kind of did.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long have you been with Kechi now?
A little over a year.
A little over a year. Okay. That's been there long enough to, maybe experience some challenges and some things that maybe caught you off guard or you weren't expecting or whatnot. What have been some of the challenges or things that you've encountered that you're like, oh, wow, I was never even aware of this, never even thought this would happen? Like, or, I mean, obviously with discretion, but what have been some of those challenges that you faced that have just really kind of thrown you for a loop?
My biggest one was just a couple months into the job and realizing, holy smokes, I'm at the top of the pile, and I don't have anybody to bounce things off of or talk to. You really feel like you're out there by yourself.
You do, yeah.
Because as a police chief, I had a deputy police chief, and he and I would talk about things. If we had a problem with an employee, I had somebody I could bounce it off of. I could go to my city administrator and bounce things off of him.
Yeah.
But
and a myriad of other police chiefs in the region.
yes,
Because you built the relationship over the years.
right. But that's probably the biggest thing, was just feeling like, holy smokes, who do I have to talk to? And within our region here, we have an organization, the LGN, Local Government Network.
Through Wichita State, right?
Through Wichita State, yeah. And it's really, boy, if other regions don't have it, I think it's vital to city managers, city administrators. It's city managers and administrators from the region who get together on a regular basis once a month. And we sit down and we talk about everything. But the cool part is there's no elected officials there. There's no number twos. There's just city managers and city administrators. And it's kind of the Vegas feel, what happens here stays here. So
Exactly.
what is talked about in those meetings is vitally important, because you can see that other people experience the same thing you do. And chances are somebody's dealt with something,
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
you're dealing with now. So those type of organizations are vitally important, I think.
Yeah,
and I found great resource in it. So.
Absolutely. And I was part of the LGN when I was in South Hutch, and I think I was even part of it with Sedgwick. But that was kind of a little bit of an inspiration for me to create AAME a little bit.
Oh,
The
okay.
idea of having this, by being able to create this platform where we can interact with each other as AAME matures and grows and we expand. That's something I want to have with that our online platform, the ability to have those interactions and have those sort of private exchanges, or even at the state level, that kind of deal. Because you're exactly right. I've talked about this. One of the biggest things I've talked about over the last 2.5 years is this sense of being alone or on your own island, right? And I had similar challenges when I first came into the city administrator profession because I didn't know anybody in Kansas at all, really, except for my
yeah.
brief stint in Goddard.
Yeah.
And thankfully, so I had that. And then also I got hired 6 months, June, July of 2019. So, less than like 9 months later, we're dealing with COVID, right? And I mean, I was tracking COVID even before the end of the year because I was following the news in China, and I was like, oh, I think this could come here. But I didn't have anybody to rely on. The saving grace I had was Ethan Reimer, which I'm not sure if you had a chance to interact with Ethan Reimer in Halstead.
No.
Is that I had interacted with Ethan, who was the city administrator in Halstead, while I was the public works director in Goddard through a utilities management training course that was put on by the Kansas Municipal Utilities, KMU. And so we built a friendship there, and he's a great guy. But there's just so many great people in the profession. I say it all the time when it comes, especially in Kansas, so many great city managers who will go above and beyond to help you and what have you.
It is. It's a brotherhood.
Yeah,
it really
absolutely.
is.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. And this might dovetail to a little discussion about Lemunyon and the police chief circle life situation here. But now that you've been in the chair for a year, and going back to when you were the department head and police chief, right? I'm sure there were times that you might have questioned or thought, "Oh, why are we doing it this way? Or should we do it this way? Or what have you?" Right? It's human nature. It's natural. It doesn't matter, right?
Yep.
Now that you're in the chair with a year or so under your belt, do you look back and say, "Oh man, now I know," or "I wish we had done some"?
I do. I reflect on that stuff all the time. That's an excellent question. Yeah, it is. Yeah,
you're like, "Oh my gosh, what was I thinking?" Or
and I think it goes back to your transition from thinking about a specific department to thinking about the city as a whole.
Yes.
And just recently, one of those reflections came when a department head came to me asking for pay increases for his people. Of course you want to give everybody a pay increase, but as a police chief, I thought about the same thing. I got to do this for my people. I got to fight for my people. And you would bring it to your city administrator, or city manager, and almost seemed like it fell on deaf ears. Well, it's not falling on deaf ears. It just, I need time to figure out how we're going to do this, because I have to think about the city as a whole rather than a specific department. So,
I remember starting a position in South Hutch, right?
Yeah.
And literally my first weekend, I'm getting hit up by a department head for raises, because we're all underpaid and all that.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, really, dude? Like, really? I just got here. Like, can you can you give me
They're
a minute?
feeling you out. They're feeling you out. That's what they're doing.
Yeah, oh, never mind. I won't even go down that road. But that was an interesting conversation, interesting experience there. So, but yeah, because you give this department raises. What does that mean for the other departments? Obviously,
yes,
right?
you're gonna hear something. I guarantee it. Yeah. Well, so and so got it. Why don't we get it?
I've never had an employee come to me and say I'm underworked and overpaid. I've just never had that. So that's always the interesting challenge. And man, I'll get Daly eventually on this podcast, and he'll probably share an experience that him and I had over a whiteboard one day, because he was. He was trying to pitch some ideas to me, and I was trying to break down the math and say, have you looked at it from this perspective? Like, no, I hadn't looked at it from that perspective. I go, yeah, well, maybe you need to look at that from that perspective now.
Right. Yeah, you're right. Your perspective on things changes dramatically.
Yeah. That's because you are responsible for the entire thing.
Right. Yep.
And it's easy to be. I shouldn't say it's easy. There's a lot of aspects that are difficult about this profession, whether it's at department head level or city administrator level. But everybody wants to be an advocate or a cheerleader for their team, their department. I get it. But when you get into that city administrator position, you have to think about first, second, third order of consequences of your decision making, much more so than you do at the department head level.
Yes.
And to kind of go back to the point you just made a minute ago about not having anybody to, as a sounding board, or the bigger picture is that all the weight's on your shoulders.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I think something that's very, very much overlooked and not really fully appreciated by someone who's not sat in the chair, and they've just been a department head, is that there is a freeing weight lifted off your shoulders if you truly sit down and understand this notion that you as a department head and the decisions you make are ultimately falls on the shoulders of another person, right? So even if you screw up and make a mistake, it could hurt you, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But it is the city manager who's ultimately going to pay the price and be held accountable for shortcomings in that department, right?
Yes.
And it's like there's a sense, I think, a lot of times in an organization that somebody else can worry about that. That's somebody else is the city manager. Like, you know what I mean? Because the city manager is the one that's going to get dragged over the coals, whether it's in the paper or by the governing body or whatnot, when something's not done correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. And listening to what you say, I think maybe that was the other part of it, is knowing that there weren't any layers above me.
No.
You know, as a police chief, I had the layer or the protection of the city administrator.
Yeah, you have that buffer.
Yeah. And you know, I wasn't at the top, so there's no layers
and
at
you
the
also,
top.
And I don't even know really your relationship with Lemunyon, but you had the added benefit of having a city manager who was a former police chief.
Yeah.
So
An
you had
incredible
extra
resource.
protection in that regard, because not only did you have a
resource.
resource as far as information, knowledge, and what have you, but you had that buffer, someone to run interference on any issues that might arise or that you might encounter as the police chief, right?
And he was a great mentor through my career, just having that resource to go to and talk, to talk to somebody about the problems, because, he had dealt with many of the same things I was experiencing.
For the audience, Richard Lemunyon is the former police chief for Wichita PD. He was involved in the BTK killer thing. That was a serial killer. That was his big claim to, I shouldn't say claim to fame, but that was his big sort of national moment. And I'm kind of curious about that dynamic with you, not only from your role as the former police chief, but now that you are the city administrator, Matt, is how do you decide what to let go on and where to sort of have your finger on the scale when it comes to overseeing operations, right?
Yeah.
Because, for example, when I brought Daly in as my police chief, I've never been a police chief. And I'm pretty good at delegating. If you're competent, I'm really good at delegating. If you're incompetent, I'm really terrible at delegating. But for him, he was phenomenal. And I had, he's my subject matter expert. I let him run his show the way he wanted to run it.
Yeah, super important.
Yeah. You come in, not only are you a young, first-time police chief and you're growing your career, you're in a small community. You have Wichita PD's chief who's overseeing you. Can you talk a little bit about what that dynamic was, maybe from the beginning over time, as far as delegating responsibilities, power, and authority, as far as letting you run your show, and then now you pivot to you being the person who's at the top, and how much involvement do you have on the day-to-day operations of your police department as opposed to delegating?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because having the right administrator is vitally important to the success of your department heads. And I learned early on through Lemunyon, he had trust in his department head. So for me as a police chief, I was always secure in knowing there was a resource there for me if I needed anything. But he was very good on the other side of leaving me alone and letting me run the department.
Even from the very beginning?
Even from the very beginning.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that had to do with communication, as we communicated on a regular basis. So, he had updates of what was going on in the police department. If there was anything that may hit the news, he was the first one to know before it hit the news, so he could tell the council or whatever he needed to do. But I learned a lot from him from that aspect of allowing your police chief or your department heads to do their jobs. Now, with that said, I saw department heads throughout our city who maybe weren't doing their job, and was able to watch that interaction that he had with them of, maybe guiding them a little more than they needed guided, coaching them to help them. So there's a delicate balance there, and it really comes down to the staff that you have when you go to a new city, you have brand new people. They're not your choice.
Yes.
So you have to feel them out, and it takes a long time. It's nothing, for me, I'm still trying to learn the personalities and everything else of my department heads. But for me, creating that communication between us so we're on the same page allows me to build trust in them and let them do their job. So, and I think it's important for me as the new guy on the block to let them do that and support them as I can to allow them to do their job.
Yeah, but here's the thing too, right? If we're being really honest here, is this is your first city administrator gig.
Yes.
So you have a tremendous amount of pressure on your shoulders in order to get it right? Because if you don't want to be a one and done, right? You don't want to get your first crack and then have it blow up in your face and you are unemployable at that point in time, right?
Yes, correct.
And I remember facing some similar concerns or challenges in Sedgwick when I first got hired because it was my very first. Well, I've been candid. I'll talk about it. I got fired in Goddard. Okay, so I got Resnick fired, and that was a tough experience. And we talked a little bit earlier about you having a limited number of opportunities. Same for me because I had just purchased a house. I got fired literally 2 weeks before my first house payment was due.
Ouch.
Yeah, the one that we're sitting in right here 6 years later. And the challenge was I was planning on being in Goddard for a few years to get some seasoning under my belt and then explore the idea of becoming a city manager either here or in another state, right? I wanted to put 5 years in Kansas, get invested in capers, and then see where things were going to go. Well, getting fired kind of threw a little monkey wrench in those plans because before I bought this house, I was also aware of the fact that many communities in this region had residency requirements for their administrator.
Oh, yes, yes.
And so I get the job in Sedgwick. Miraculously, I was desperate. I just forced them to hire me. I held the mayor hostage. I didn't let him out of the closet. I said, "You're going to hire me." Thankfully he did. Shout out to Brian Chapman. I love him. He gave me my break. And then I'm there, and in my first week with my police chief, let me put it this way: my first week of being there, my police chief is sending me a text message apologizing for how he interacted with me because we had a moment. Okay. And we had a moment.
Okay.
And I was not sure how this. I knew really early on this relationship was not going to work. Okay. And I guess I want to be careful what I say. But I'm unfiltered. So, wow, what should I say here? I knew I had to cut him loose. Okay, very shortly after. Okay, go back to credibility, right? That sort of deal. Brady Giglio, that type of thing. I had to cut him loose.
Different rules for those people. Yeah.
Yeah, but here I am, literally 1 month into my tenure, and I've been told, again, small town Kansas, he's been there for a while, that he has supermajority support from the governing body. And I don't have I got hired as a city administrator without the ability to hire and fire unilaterally without, consulting with the governing body at that point in time.
Yeah.
That's some scary stuff.
Yes.
Because I am not the type of guy who I just do not roll over and I can't allow I can't let someone get over on me. I can't allow someone to lie to me or try to manipulate me. And I'm not a go along, get along type of guy. And I was petrified. I'll be honest, Matt, I was petrified because I just got this job and I'm 1 month in and I'm like, what do I do here? I talked to, by the way, I didn't know when to talk to here. I didn't know any other city managers except Ethan. Right. And I didn't feel comfortable, honestly. I didn't know him that well. I didn't feel comfortable talking about this situation.
Yeah.
And I didn't know a soul in Kansas. I remember I've only been here for literally a year at this point. Literally a year in the state of Kansas. I knew nobody when I got here. And I'm like, what do I do? And I'm talking to some, confidants that I know. And they're like, hey, they know my situation. They know that I got to pay a mortgage. You know what I mean? They know I've gotten off to a rough start. And they're like, you just got to keep your head down. It's just don't fight this battle right now. It's not the time for it.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. Multiple people told me this. Huh. And I tried, Matt. It's like the Pulp Fiction. Like, I'm trying hard, Ringo.
Yeah,
I'm trying real
yeah.
hard. You know what I mean? And I try. I couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. You know, Mike Singletary. You know, San Francisco 49ers can't do it. Won't do it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And so the rubber met the road. You know, and I had to go into closed session and make a case. And I had no idea how it was going to shake out, Matt, because I knew that by me going in there and setting these chain of events in motion, that I was walking a hard line. So either I came out victorious or I was going to come out a loser in one way or the other, because if I didn't get what I needed done, then I would have no power or leverage in that organization with respect to that individual.
I could see that. Yeah.
And it's tough to be a first-year city administrator.
Yeah.
And you're trying to navigate those waters.
Yeah.
So it's a long way of coming back to the whole thing of like, hey, you want to delegate, you want to be this, inspirational, charismatic leader. You want, to get the best out of everybody. You're super excited. It's your first crack at the apple. I'm sure you're so energetic and chomping at the bit that you can't wait to get into work every day like I did, Matt.
Yeah.
And then you realize like, that's not the same for everybody.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And you still got to make sure you're successful because you got a multi-year career ahead of you still.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
When you think about this whole situation and how your career is, I guess, developing as you go along, where do you see your strengths? I guess what weaknesses do you see yourself having to sort of bolster or shore up as you move forward, or what have you learned about yourself through this process that maybe you weren't aware of as now that you've been in this role?
Yeah, that's a good question. That self-reflection type of piece, and I don't know if I have a good answer. I think for me, and for other people I have talked to, knowing that you can't be great at everything, and that it's a continual learning curve. Now you see your salty old city managers who've been there, done that sort of thing, and we'll all be to that point at some time in our career, hopefully, if we make it that long. Yeah. But just continuing to learn and staying connected, I think, is the huge thing. Staying connected with other city managers to see how they handle situations, kind of see what best practices are, I guess I could say. For me, it's just continually learning, in my field. I don't know if I have a good answer for you.
No, I'm just curious. And then I'm kind of curious a little bit too is, how have you managed your communication as a new manager, as a a former police chief with your governing body? What can you maybe unpack that a little bit? Because I always think that's a fascinating challenge,
right,
or issue.
And I would say if you're a police chief aspiring to be a city manager, if you think that your position is political now, hang on, because it's going to change, because it is extremely political. You go from having one boss to having 5, 6,
depending on your jurisdiction.
Depending on the makeup of your board or your council. So you have to manage all those relationships. And I think my communication comes from getting to know those people and knowing what type of communication they like, right?
Right.
Because you have council members who want to know everything. And you have the extreme on the other side of council members who just want to know the nuts and bolts. Tell me what I need to make the decision so I can come to this meeting and get home and eat dinner.
Yes.
That sort of thing. And they're both good people to have on a board. You want that dynamic, but you have to. My biggest challenge, I think, has been learning those personalities and learning how to communicate in the right way with each one, yet providing them all with the same information.
That's a great point.
Not telling the person who needs to know everything, not telling them more than the person who doesn't
on the
want to
essential
know
items.
On the essential items, you know. So making sure that the information you're putting out is consistent, you know, and if they have questions, then you can tell them more, but making sure there's consistency in what you're putting out. And for me, I learned this when I served on the school board: don't surprise me.
Yes.
and don't surprise them.
Yes.
So that is a conversation I had with my counsel at the very onset, that I will do my best to make sure that you don't show up to a council meeting and are surprised by anything that we present.
That should almost be rule number one. For a city manager is
don't do that to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, don't blindside me.
Be respectful to you, right?
Don't blindside me at a meeting, because if that does happen, well, number one, you look like a fool, but I can't have the answer for you.
Yes.
Give me a heads up. I will, if you want to bring something up at the meeting that we haven't talked about, great. Give me the heads up and let me provide the information in that meeting so I don't have to come back to you. So,
very spot on. Because when you first said surprise me, and I think you meant it both, but when you first said don't surprise me, I thought you were talking about, hey, to your department heads and to your staff, don't let me be surprised as a city manager, right?
Well, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But also,
there's
even more
those
importantly,
conversations
it's like,
that
hey,
have been had. Right.
because too often, and it's frustrating, because I had this experience a little bit in Sedgwick, and I had tremendous relationships with both my councils in Sedgwick and South Hutchinson.
Yeah.
Phenomenal. I couldn't ask for better situations. Like amazing.
Yep.
But there were numerous instances, and they weren't gotcha questions or anything like that. There was nothing pointed or nefarious about ambushing me at a meeting with a question. Like that wasn't what happened.
Yeah.
But I would regularly get questions at the meeting, and I wouldn't know the answer necessarily because you just hit me at the moment.
Yes.
And I would try to tell my governing body, listen, I want to give you guys the information as quickly and to all of you as possible, right? Because if you ask me a question and I don't know the answer because you didn't give me a heads up, I don't really want to go through the whole whack-a-mole of sending out an email to every person necessarily, or having to call you individually or whatnot, right?
Yes.
And it's like, all you got to do is read the packet I send out on Friday and just send me a text or email or give me a call sometime between then and our meeting.
Yes.
And I will be prepared to give you an answer because I want you to have the answer. I'm not trying to hide anything from you.
Yes. Yeah, that is frustrating. And not just being a city administrator, but I have experienced that throughout my career. Even as a police chief, you, especially during budget season, you would provide your budget package during budget discussions to your city council, and there was inevitably the one person who would show up, and you knew they didn't read a lick of what you put in there. You spent hours and hours developing those packets, and you knew that they didn't look at it once in the week prior.
Yeah.
So, that's frustrating.
The joys of being a department head, and it's funny. I will say this. This podcast and my focus is always on advocating for city managers and that whole deal, right?
Yep.
But let's be honest. We have a lot of city managers that sometimes do the same thing to their department heads that the governing bodies do to us that we don't like. And so I guess this is a reminder to the city managers, like, hey, treat your department heads like you want to be treated by your governing body and what have you, right?
Good point.
I mean,
good point.
If you have a department head who's going to put the work in and deliver a report or presentation, hey, give them the courtesy of reviewing it, right? And knowing what's going on.
And giving feedback on it. Sure. Yeah.
It's just, I think sometimes we get a little bit too caught up in our own little silo. We all are, human beings. We're all capable of doing that. And I try to give some love to the department heads and the non-managers. I don't want to always be super one-sided, Matt. You know what I mean, and what have you. So, is there anything we haven't covered over here that we think you want to chew on?
No, just through our conversation, I guess maybe we'd step back a little bit with, communicating with your department heads. And one thing that I found transitioning from a police chief to a city administrator that I needed to be very cognizant of is not having the perception that because I was a police chief, I'm giving my police department special consideration.
Oh, we didn't talk about that. You're right. Yes, that could be super.
And I think if you're...
It's like the daddy goggles for when you're coaching your kid at Little League or something,
Yeah. You coming from the public works field, you didn't want there to be that perception that you were giving public works more than...
No, actually I did, Matt. I was a little different because I got so tired of all you prima donna, police chiefs and police officers getting all the new equipment and toys and all my public works guys getting the hand-me-down. So no, and half joking, half serious, I did actually try to go out of my way to show, hey, not play favoritism, but try to maybe play some catch up. You know what I mean? But I think you make a really good point here, because it is very easy, and it could be a very easy pitfall to fall into, that if you are a new police chief coming into a new administrator coming to an organization with a police chief history, that you could perceive to be as, oh, you're one of the guys or you're one of the gals, and that's going to be the golden child department.
Exactly.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah. So for me, very cognizant of that, is making sure that, we have a great police department, we have a great public works department, and not showing favoritism towards one or the other, because I think there's just by default some appearance of favoritism just because of who you are, and what you did.
Or human nature, it's the perceived expectation. So we perceive or project what we think onto others, even though it's not necessarily true. Right. But and this kind of goes back into one of the benefits of, or the strengths of a police chief coming into that city manager role, is we know that in the public domain and in much of life, perception can be or is reality.
Yeah, it can be.
That's just the truth.
Unfortunately.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Matt, I really appreciate you coming in here, sitting down at my dining room table. My house is a little bit of a mess right now, so I appreciate you not commenting on that. Jeff Cantrell was really gracious with his compliments. My house is a mess right now. I'm not sure what the hell.
Did he tear it up or what?
No, he was he was very praised it, and it was nice. But I mean, if people could see what we're looking at right here, it'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe Turner's living like that.
Yeah,
but no, we are in a state of transition and chaos right now in our Wichita household. So trying to figure out what we're going to do here long term. But I do appreciate you coming to my home and sitting down with me and breaking bread. It's been a really good chat, and shout out to Michael Pursley, the Albany, Georgia police chief. He's the one that had the idea for this conversation, and so I called you up and said, "Hey, you want to do it?" And you go, "Let's do it."
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, I hope that maybe it's some good advice, inspires those. I don't want to, I think some of the discussion may be somewhat focused on the negatives of being a city manager, but it's a great profession.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah.
It really is. A huge learning curve. There's just new things you have to deal with every day, but it's a great profession.
I don't think I asked you, what's your favorite part of the job?
Working with the people, doing good things for the community, making things better, just like it was in the police business, being that public servant. I'm not out there fighting crime or taking criminals off the street in a direct way, through managing the police department. I am, but making the city better as a whole.
I'm glad you brought this up, because actually that reminds me, when you stop and think about the police chief and police department, the overwhelming bulk of your interactions with the community have a negative light to it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and here as a city administrator, you are getting a much different perspective on how to help people and provide value to them, right?
Yeah.
And they're not always they're not always gunning for you, right? They're not, literally or figuratively,
Right.
So.
Right. Very true. Yes,
well, hey, Matt, thank you so much. I appreciate it. My name is Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. If you are not aware, we have the new AAME job board at jobs.aame.org. It is a free job board, so if you have any senior or executive level recruitments, please post those today. Please share that resource with your listserv, whether it's a city manager or your HR director listserv, and get the word out, because it is the only job board in the nation that is focused exclusively on senior and executive level local government recruitments. We're pretty proud of it. It's gaining momentum, so please support that. And stay tuned for future news and information about the upcoming AAME conference. We're going to be having our annual conference in June down in El Cajon near San Diego in Southern California. Pretty excited about that. And we've been having some ongoing discussions about the AAME model contract and how we can get some semblance of power, or return some balance to that power imbalance when it comes to the city manager contracts that we are signing. We are going to be doing some pretty innovative stuff with that contract. I think we're going to be modeling the new way forward. So if you are an AAME founding member, make sure you go catch our webinar and participate in that discussion. And if you're not a member, think about joining the organization when we reopen for membership. If you go to aame.org, there is a waitlist sign-up form at the bottom on the homepage. So fill that out, and we will hit you up when we open. On that note, catch you next week.